Labour migration plan torn apart. The chairman of Migration Watch UK just went on GB News and declared that Shabana Mahmood's immigration overhaul is pitiful, while accusing the government of lacking the courage to do what's necessary, which according to him is detaining migrants and sending them back to France regardless of what the European Court of Human Rights says. Alp Mehmet is absolutely furious that Sudanese migrants accused of people smuggling are getting acquitted or non-custodial sentences, and his solution is basically ignore international law and deport everyone anyway. And whether you think that's common sense immigration enforcement or dangerous disregard for legal obligations, you cannot deny that his frustration represents a significant chunk of British voters who think the entire system is broken beyond repair. So buckle up, because we're about to dissect why Migration Watch UK thinks Labour's latest immigration reforms are worthless. But before we proceed, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more updates on the UK political insight. Thank you. Why Mehmet believes both British and European judges are daft, and whether his proposed solution of mass detention and deportation to France would actually work or just create new legal and diplomatic nightmares. This is the immigration debate at its most heated and uncompromising, where frustration with the current system meets calls for action that might violate international treaties Britain has signed. Right, let's start with what Alp Mehmet actually proposed, because his position is unambiguous and controversial. He says Britain should detain migrants arriving illegally, deal with their cases quickly, and then remove them, sending them back to France if necessary. His argument is that if they're here illegally and don't qualify for asylum, France should take them back. Simple. It's as straightforward as that if we only had the courage to do that, he declares, framing this as a failure of political will rather than legal constraint. The immediate problem with this proposal, which Mehmet acknowledges, is the European Court of Human Rights. The ECHR has repeatedly ruled on cases involving deportation, detention conditions, and refugee rights in ways that constrain what Britain can do. Mehmet's position seems to be that we should detain and deport anyway, legal obligations be damned, which raises fundamental questions about whether Britain should honor international treaties it signed or unilaterally ignore them when inconvenient. His claim that we can do this, despite ECHR constraints, is disputed by lawyers and governments who've tried. The reason successive governments haven't simply detained everyone and shipped them to France isn't lack of courage, it's that doing so would violate multiple international agreements, trigger legal challenges that government would lose, and potentially damage diplomatic relations with France. Mehmet frames this as cowardice, but it might also be recognizing legal and practical reality. The accusation that no government that we've got and seen in recent years has been prepared to do that applies to both Conservative and Labour governments, suggesting he thinks the entire political establishment lacks the will to take necessary action. That's a populist position that resonates with voters frustrated by immigration numbers, but doesn't grapple with why governments of different ideological stripes have all reached similar conclusions about what's legally and practically possible. The context for this discussion was recent court cases where Sudanese migrants accused of piloting channel crossing boats were acquitted or received non-custodial sentences. Mehmet and presenter Chrystis are both outraged that someone allegedly caught with 7 Sudanese people in their car, plus equipment for channel crossings near Calais, wasn't convicted. That does seem like a straightforward people smuggling case, which raises questions about why prosecutions are failing. Mehmet's explanation is that judges have got an eye on the ECHR and previous case law that pushes them toward leniency. He claims everything in the last 10-15 years pushes judges to let them off rather than impose prison sentences, partly because prisons are already overcrowded. That's a systemic critique, suggesting the entire legal framework is biased toward asylum seekers and against enforcement, whether through judicial philosophy, case law precedent, or practical constraints like prison capacity. His declaration that British and European judges are daft and the French are in just as much difficulties as we are broadens the criticism beyond Britain to suggest this is a continent-wide failure of judicial systems that are tied into the whole process, the whole system that is imposed on them by Brussels, by the Commission, and all that. That's Eurosceptic framing that blames EU structures and institutions for constraining national governments' ability to control their borders. The statistics Mehmet cites paint a picture of overwhelming numbers. 160,000 asylum seekers in France last year, 1 million coming into the EU, 240,000 detected crossing illegally. Those numbers, if accurate, do suggest a migration crisis of enormous scale that makes individual deportations feel like bailing out a sinking ship with a teaspoon. His observation that authorities are throwing their arms up in the air and saying, what's the point with all this, captures a sense of futility about enforcement when the numbers are so vast. But the comparison between Britain and France complicates Mehmet's send them back to France proposal. If France is dealing with 160,000 asylum seekers and is equally constrained by EU and ECHR rules, why would they accept migrants being returned from Britain? They'd have the same legal objections and practical constraints that make mass deportation difficult. The proposal assumes French cooperation that might not materialize. His characterization of Shabana Mahmood's announcement as pitiful is harsh, but reflects genuine frustration that Labour's immigration reforms don't go nearly far enough for people who want radical action. Mahmood has proposed changes to asylum processing, refugee status reviews, and deportation procedures, but clearly Migration Watch UK thinks these are inadequate tinkering with a fundamentally broken system. The statement, "We can't rely on anyone other than ourselves," after noting France hasn't deported people smugglers, captures a nationalist impulse that Britain should act unilaterally regardless of international cooperation or legal constraints. It's arguing for sovereignty over immigration enforcement, even when that conflicts with treaties and agreements Britain has signed. Whether that's pragmatic nationalism or dangerous isolationism depends entirely on your perspective. The example of someone getting a 2-year banning order from France, which Mehmet dismisses as ineffective because that's not going to bother him, illustrates his point that current enforcement is toothless. If people smugglers face minimal consequences and can return to operations quickly, then prosecution becomes almost meaningless as a deterrent. His conclusion that Britain must deport these people ourselves when they arrive assumes unilateral capacity that might not exist given legal and diplomatic constraints. What's interesting about this GB News segment is how it represents a particular strand of immigration debate that's frustrated with incremental policy changes and wants dramatic action. Mehmet isn't arguing for tweaking asylum processing times or adjusting deportation procedures, he's arguing for mass detention and removal regardless of legal obstacles. That's appealing to voters who see the current system as completely broken but raises serious questions about rule of law and international obligations. The charge that government lacks courage reframes what might be legal impossibility as political cowardice. If courts rule that certain deportations violate ECHR, is ignoring those rulings courage or lawlessness? If international treaties prevent certain actions, is breaking treaties brave or reckless? Mehmet's position assumes the obstacles are political will rather than legal reality, which is a fundamental disagreement about what's actually possible. Patrick Chrystis' role as host is to amplify these concerns by presenting cases that seem obviously criminal, but result in acquittals. The example of someone with 7 people and channel crossing equipment near Calais does seem like clear evidence of smuggling, so why wasn't it prosecuted successfully? That's a legitimate question that deserves answers about whether prosecution standards are too high, evidence is inadequate, or judges are applying law in ways that make convictions almost impossible.